All right, good afternoon, everybody. Today we are going to be going over punctuation. It's important for us to understand the basics of punctuation because not only is it going to come up in the ACT itself, but it's also going to be really helpful when we are writing those admissions essays. So, first off, we are going to go over what are some of the punctuation points that we use fairly often. So, we have the period, the comma, colon, dash, semicolon, exclamation point, question mark, and apostrophe. Those are ones that we use fairly regularly in our everyday lives. So, it's kind of hard for us to understand all the time when we need to use which punctuation point. So, in order for us to better understand that, we are going to be using what we call the stoplight analogy. So, we all know that the red light when we're driving means come to a complete stop. That is the same when we are talking about our stop punctuation points. Now, our stop punctuation points are a period, comma, semicolon, exclamation point, and a question mark. But the only thing we need to think about is when we want to use a comma as our stop punctuation point, we need to follow it by what we call a conjunction. And so a conjunction is a word that helps connect two clauses together so it makes more sense as a complete sentence. So what are some examples of a fanboy? So we have for and nor, but, or, yet, so. Fanboys, that's how we remember all of those. So in order to use a comma as a stop punctuation point when we are connecting two independent clauses, it has to be followed by one of those words. Next, the yellow light is our slow down punctuation, where we slow down, we pause, but we don't have to come to a complete stop. When we are using slow down punctuation, we are using a comma, which connects a dependent clause and an independent clause together to make a complete sentence. So, when using a comma to connect an independent and dependent clause together, it doesn't have to be followed by one of those fanboys because it's just connecting a dependent and an independent clause together. So, now we need to understand a little bit more about what an independent clause is versus a dependent clause. So, an independent clause is something that has, or a phrase that has a subject and a verb, and it is a complete thought. A dependent clause can also have a subject and a verb, but it doesn't really have a complete thought on its own. So I'm going to give you an example of a clause, and I would like you guys to let me know if you think it's a dependent or an independent clause. Originally influenced by punk rock bands. What do you guys think? Do you think that little phrase is an independent or a dependent clause? Correct, it is a dependent clause because if we're reading it, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense on its own. In order for it to be a complete thought, it needs to be connected with punctuation to an independent clause so it makes sense. So when you're doing your writing, or if you're in your ACT and you're trying to figure out if something is a dependent clause or an independent clause, a good question to ask yourself is, does this make sense on its own, or does it need to be connected to another clause in order for it to actually make sense? So that is the basics between independent and dependent clauses. Like we said, we need to use punctuation points in order to connect independent and independent clauses or dependent and independent clauses. Those are very important. Now, before we move on, there are two other punctuation points that we haven't covered yet because we don't use them as often. But those are the dash and the colon. Those we need to use when we are usually doing something like listing something out, or if we're going to be explaining something or giving an example of something. The trick is they need to be preceded by an independent clause. So an example could be, there are many different types of fruits, colon, banana, comma, apple, comma, oranges, etc. It needs to, the colon or the dash needs to be followed by a list, explanation, or example. And then if you're writing a list out, you need to separate those words with commas. So with all that in mind,